Welcome back to the gun bench. Today we're going to be taking a look at a Remington 1894 10 gauge. Now the 1894 was Remington's first attempt at a hammerless shotgun. So up to this point, Remington had only made hammer shotguns. So if you're not familiar with shotgun actions, a hammer gun is something like this. So you have an external hammer that is cocked. There's springs in here that are then released by the trigger. When that hammer falls forward, it hits the firing pin and sends your shell downrange. Now, in the late 1880s, a lot of gun manufacturers started taking all of those mechanisms you just saw that were external and putting them internally into an action. So a hammerless gun is one where you do not have an external hammer. Remington, in their 1894, created a very, very interesting action that worked very well for accomplishing that purpose. So these guns are built well. 1894s are fairly common. There's about 40,000 of them made. And they are mostly 10s and 12 gauges. There are a few 16s out there. This 10 gauge in particular was made in 1901. It's an interesting 10 gauge in the fact that if you take a look at it, the screws are in very good alignment, haven't really been boogered with. The action is incredibly tight. I can barely open and close it, meaning that it probably hasn't been fired much. We take a look at the barrels at the end here. They're in very good condition. Now, when you get closer to the actions where it gets a little funky, at some point there must have been a little bit of rust here, surface rust, that wasn't taken care of, because you can see where the Damascus isn't easily seen, and the case color is a little faded on the action. But in any case, this gun in particular is an A grade. So you ask, how do I know that? So there's a few ways to tell. If you look very closely here, there's no engraving whatsoever on the action. It also has a very standard piece of English walnut. Nothing fancy with the checkering, no fleur-de-lises or anything. But no engraving whatsoever. Now, there's another way to tell, which is more definitive and it's easier than trying to figure out what's the difference between an A grade and a specialty grade. And that would be by taking a look at the flats on the barrel, or I'm sorry, not the flats on the barrel, but the actual flats on the action. So, Remington also made a 1900, which was another hammerless shotgun. If you're having trouble identifying if it's an 1894 or 1900, taking a look at the forearm will tell you immediately what it is. So if you notice on this forearm, the release is here, the mechanism. For a 1900, it does not have any mechanism at all. It's just a standard forearm that is released simply by picking it up. It'll be longer and there'll be no mechanism. So in this case, we know immediately it's an 1894 because it does have a mechanism. It's a little bit shorter too. So if we pull this off, and again, this is very tight as well. I don't think this gun was used much. You can see here. That's how it works. But if we pull the barrels off of the action, we can take a look and see that this is an A grade. So depending on what type of 1894 you have, there'll be different letters here. So the way Remington graded their guns for the 1894, and again, this is different for some of their previous guns. So for instance, if you had an 1889, the grades are 1, 2, 3, 1 being the simplest, 2, 3, etc., becoming more elaborate, more intense in the type of barrels used, the type of metal used, the type of engraving on it. When you get to the 1894s, it's by letter. So A is their field grade or their lowest grade. B, a little nicer. C, a little nicer. D, E, specialty, etc. So A is the most basic. As you go up the alphabet, it gets more elaborate, which is the opposite of some other makers. So if you're Parker, you go the other direction. But in any case, if we take a look here, with this gun in particular, with the 1894, there's actually nothing internally different about an A grade or the nicest 1894 possible. All of the internals are exactly the same. Exactly the same. The only difference is the engraving on them, the type of wood used, how the checkering's done, and possibly what type of barrels are used. So there might be different steels involved. But the actual internals are exactly the same. So for this 10 gauge in particular, it's pretty basic. It's an A grade. It doesn't even have ejectors. So if you have something that says AE or BE on the flats in there, what you're looking at is something that has ejectors. So you might be asking, what is an ejector? So let me put the gun together real quickly and I'll explain it. So it's funny, in the actual Remington literature that was used to try to sell the 1894s, all the literature would only mention AEs, BEs, CEs, etc., meaning grade A with ejectors. So an ejector, so after you would fire your triggers, when you'd break the gun open, and again, this one's tough to open, so excuse my struggling there. So with a shell, after you had fired it, the ejector would actually physically throw the shell back. So it'd be in the chamber and it'd be thrown back. Now, the most basic guns, and in the original 1894, the actual catalogs, they'd be $22.50 cheaper. So for those original ones, they would have extractors. So after you fired it, it would look just like this, and you would have to manually remove the shell. Manually remove it. So as a cheaper option. So whoever bought this gun, they got the lowest possible gun that they could from Remington at the time. So this is an A grade, the lowest, and it doesn't have ejectors. So it was even cheaper than what you would see advertised in the manuals. So very basic gun, working man gun, which is odd to me why it is in such good shape. Typically, if you have an A grade or something that's like a field grade, very basic gun, they're typically beat. So the checkering will typically be worn smooth. The guns will be in pretty rough shape on the outside. You'll typically have cracks in the wood. They were used not just to be hunted a few times a year or to be taken to a special club or something. They were used to bring meat to the table. So the fact that this A grade is in such good shape doesn't really make a ton of sense to me. But I'm very happy with it because now I am the custodian of this for the next few years. And I have a very good and solid gun to hand down to the next generation. I do hunt with this gun. I will say that it more or less hibernates in my safe, though, because I don't shoot it well. For whatever reason, it's choked, modified, improved, modified. It has a decent length of pull for me, a decent drop in the stock. It should, in theory, be shot well just by the standard dimensions it has and the choking it has, but I don't shoot it well. I miss a lot of doves with it. I miss a lot of small game with it. I don't know why. Give me a 32-inch gun with extra full chokes and I will outperform this gun for whatever reason. Maybe the original owner had the same problem, didn't shoot well for him or her, and they decided just to throw it in the safe or throw it wherever and not deal with it. But in any case, this is a Remington 1894. They are graded starting with A's being the lowest, going up through the alphabet. There'll also be specialty or trap grades. You can tell by looking in here, taking a look at what letters you see. If you see an E, it means it has ejectors. If you have a lot of engraving on it, you can also tell kind of what it is. But the biggest difference, when you're looking at a Remington and you're not sure what it is, the only thing you really need to remember for the 1894s and the 1900s to be able to tell the two apart, because the 1900 is a less well-made gun, is take a look at the forearms. Just remember that. As long as you know to look at the forearms, when you take a look, as long as you know that there's a mechanism on the 1894 and not one on the 1900, you're not going to be able to get it confused. Because Remington didn't make a ton of side-by-side shotguns. For whatever reason, they're not really in the discussion when we talk about vintage American side-by-sides. You typically see Fox, Parker, L.C. Smith, maybe even Baker before you see a Remington. Remington did make some very high-quality guns, though, especially if you get to the higher quality B, C's, D's, and E's in the Remingtons. They are beautiful guns. The engraving on them is immaculate. The people who are working on them were highly skilled. So these guns, they shouldn't really be looked at as any less than a Fox or a Parker. They're very well made, made here in the United States. The 1894s, again, Remington's first attempt at a side-by-side shotgun, very successful attempt. About 40,000 of them made. If you find one in good condition, they're not a bad gun to have. They shoot well for most people. I don't know what it is with me and this gun in particular, but they're very great guns. If you find them, hold on to them, keep them alive, and don't let them just waste away and be forgotten.